Hello. So today I wanted to talk about what gluten does in the body and how gluten affects gut health and inflammation. So yesterday we talked about gluten and who should avoid it, who should consider avoiding it, and why. Before we jump into exactly what gluten does in the body, I wanted to talk a little bit about testing for some of these things that we talked about yesterday, which were celiac disease, non-celiac, gluten sensitivity, and autoimmunity. And I had a great comment from someone on Instagram about the video about testing, when to test, and how do you know if you have these things. And it's a great point because with celiac testing for celiac disease, you have to be consuming a diet that contains gluten in order for the blood test to be accurate. So a lot of times what happens is if you think that gluten might be a culprit in how you feel and you remove gluten for a certain period of time and you start to feel a lot better, then you may not be able to get the test for celiac disease. And it wouldn't be accurate right then because you haven't been consuming gluten. And for some people, the thought of bringing in gluten again after they have realized how much better they feel without it isn't an option. So then you're kind of left not knowing if you fully do have a diagnosis of celiac disease, which is an autoimmune condition, or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So this woman brought up a great point about testing and just considering it if you do have history of autoimmunity in your family, history of celiac, and if you are thinking that gluten might be causing you some symptoms, can definitely be beneficial to speak to your doctor and get some testing. Some people might say that, well, if you're going to cut gluten out no matter what, why does it matter? But I think it's always good to know, right, really what's going on and how vigilant you do have to be with certain things like cross-contamination of gluten. So just something to think about before we dive in. So what I want to talk about today is a little bit deeper, a little bit more specific about what actually gluten is doing in the body. So we're just going to dive right in. So what happens when you eat gluten? Either a piece of bread or in a sauce or in different hidden sources of gluten. It travels through your stomach and arrives in your small intestine, goes through some processes of digestion. And what we now know is that it triggers a release of something called zonulin. So zonulin is a chemical that signals the tight junctions, which we'll talk about more, of your intestinal wall to open up, creating intestinal permeability, or what you may have heard of as leaky gut. And so this idea of zonulin and leaky gut was shown to us by researcher Dr. Alessio Fasano, and I can put up some links to those studies there. So that's how we know a little bit more about zonulin in the body. So you can think of the lining of your gut as a mesh strainer, and it allows some particles, small particles, nutrients from the food we eat to pass into our bloodstream, to get absorbed through the bloodstream. But it stops big particles that aren't meant to be there in our bloodstream from getting in. And it's a semi-permeable membrane, right? We want some things to be able to go in, those nutrients that we get from our food, but we definitely want some barriers there so we don't have a lot of these bigger particles coming in and causing problems. So these bigger particles are things like toxins or partially digested foods, and more, and microbes, and so that's kind of the issue with zonulin and gluten, is that it starts to cause these small mesh holes, if we think of a mesh strainer, to widen and allow bigger particles to get in and cause this, what we call leaky gut. And so in the case of your gut, the things that are getting in are, like I said, microbes, toxins, proteins, and partially digested foods that are escaping into the bloodstream. And so, since these things aren't supposed to be there, what happens is our immune system starts to mount a response against them, a response to get rid of them, and it creates this inflammatory response to get rid of them. And that's what we want our immune system to do, right? Is to protect us from invaders and bacteria and things like that coming in from the external world. But when that membrane or those barrier systems have become widened or leaky, and it is letting things that aren't supposed to be in there in, that's when we get that immune response that we don't want. So when gluten fragments cross this barrier and get inside the body, these protein fragments interact with what's called the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT, which stimulates the release of inflammatory cytokines, activates the cells of both the innate and adaptive immune system. And inflammation is triggered by gluten fragments, as well as other partially digested food proteins, gut bacteria, fragments, and waste products like toxins crossing over. So it's definitely gluten is getting over there too, but lots of other things as well. And so this further activates the immune system, causing a vicious cycle of inflammation and then this gut barrier damage, which leads to leaky gut. So that is specifically why gluten-containing grains are typically the most problematic for those with gut issues or autoimmune disease. And you can see why that would be true is if we already have other things going on with our gut. We know that 70% of our immune system lies in the area surrounding our gut. So if we know that we already have imbalance of good and bad bacteria, some gut inflammation, we've taken a lot of antibiotics, we have a genetic predisposition to autoimmunity, having this idea of leaky gut or things crossing this barrier that are causing further stimulation and activation of our immune system is not good, especially for if you have autoimmunity or gut issues. So one thing I will say too is this kind of complicates it even further, is that every time your body is exposed to an invader, and in this case we can think of it as gluten or a bigger protein that's kind of gotten into an area where it's not supposed to be, so our immune system is on high alert, the immune system memorizes the structure so that it can develop the defense to that pathogen and recognize it in the future. That's how our immune system works, our adaptive immune system. And so the immune system recognition system isn't perfect. And as long as the molecule structure is similar enough, the immune system registers it as an invader and attacks it. So gluten, specifically the structure of gluten, is a larger protein. And it happens to be structurally similar to a number of our body's tissues, particularly what we're finding, our thyroid. So in those specifically with autoimmune thyroid conditions, every time they eat gluten, the immune system sends out antibodies to detect and destroy the gluten, but since the gluten and the thyroid particles look so similar, some of those immune cells end up attacking the thyroid by mistake. And so this is called molecular mimicry, and you can look up more about that concept as well. So gluten's not the only thing that does that. Sometimes the casein and dairy, if people react to that, can cause similar issues, but gluten is definitely one that can do this. So this information here about what gluten does in the body once it's kind of crossed that barrier is coming straight from Dr. Sarah Ballantyne's book, The Paleo Approach, which kind of details how gluten moves into the bloodstream and what our immune system does there. So that's a great resource to learn more about that. And like I said, there's just so much research coming out these days about what gluten is specifically doing in our body. So I hope that gives you a good idea. It's just kind of a deep dive into specifically when we eat a piece of gluten, it's affecting our gut and then in turn affecting our immune system. So we can see definitely for those of us that are predisposed to autoimmunity are looking to kind of calm down any sort of immune stimulation, or those of us that have gut issues already, that if we are introducing an inflammatory substance like gluten, that it might be harming us a little bit further or might just impact us more. So if you have any questions on this, feel free to write in the comments here and we can keep the discussion going. Tomorrow I'm going to talk a little bit more about where you find gluten and how you can avoid it and what you can eat instead, right? So we want to, understand this information so we can really think about what's going on when we eat gluten or eat different foods, and just be aware so we can see what feels right for us. But then we also have to think, okay, well, if we're not eating that, where do we find it and what do we eat instead? So I hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Thanks.